Hello everyone and welcome. It is 11:30, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Again, if you have any trouble viewing the presentation on your screen, please go to the chat box and let me know. My name is Holly Peterson. I am a Neuro Resource Facilitator here at the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa. I have a particular interest in pediatric brain injury, as well as family and caregiver issues, and grief and loss. My background is in social work, and I am a certified brain injury specialist. And today we're going to be talking about brain injury in youth and the transition to adulthood. And just so you are aware, the slides will be available on our website in the next day or so. And after the presentation, I will also be sending out a survey asking everyone to complete to give us some feedback on this topic and presentation today. So the objectives of today's webinar are to recognize and characterize the prevalence of brain injury and its trends in pediatrics specifically. So we are going to go over some pediatric brain injury 101 at the beginning of this presentation. And part of that is also to distinguish changes and challenges that occur after brain injury. And that will help us better understand as we get into the transitioning part of this presentation to identify services and supports that are available for youth with brain injury who are getting to that point of transition either into the workforce or onto further education or just trying to live independently in general. So first of all, I want to share some statistics with you. Now these are statistics that, they're general statistics, so both adults and pediatrics are included in these numbers. And again, it's also important to recognize that these are numbers that are reported injuries. There are many additional injuries that occur that if one doesn't go and seek medical attention for, they may not be categorized in this number. So I always like to point out that these numbers are likely to be low. So we do have about 1.4 million people experiencing brain injury annually, and 5.3 million live with long-term disability following a brain injury. Approximately 2,500 brain injuries occur in Iowa annually, and of those, more than 95,000 Iowans live with long-term disability after brain injury. Now, pediatrics specifically, these are numbers that the CDC reports for individuals 0 to 19 who experience a traumatic brain injury. So in 2010, more than 630,000 children were diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries in the United States. Of those, more than 35,000 were hospitalized, and more than 6,000 died due to their injuries. And again, these are numbers that were reported. There are lots of children and youth that are getting brain injuries that aren't seeking medical attention and therefore are not categorized in these numbers. Now, these numbers are really not new. There hasn't been a huge substantial increase in children experiencing traumatic brain injuries, but we are hearing more about it. And that's really just because there has been more attention to brain injury in general. And there has been more attention to sports and concussions and different youth sport concussion laws. And here in Iowa, we established a law in 2011 for youth concussion laws. So we have heard more about it here in Iowa since then as well. For those who are most at risk for brain injury for youth are ages 0 to 4, and then again 15 to 19. With 0 to 4-year-olds, we see a lot of accidental falls. In that age category, of course, they're learning how to walk, they're trying to run, so there are a lot of accidental falls that we see in that age range. But also a common a common type of traumatic brain injury that we see for children 0 to 4 is child abuse. And for 15 to 19, we often see more of those sports-related injuries and motor vehicle accidents. And again, these injuries are not new, but the attention to them is relatively new, and categorizing concussion under brain injury is also relatively new as well. So I do want to define the differences between the two main types of brain injury, which are traumatic and acquired. Traumatic brain injury occurs because of a direct blow to the head. That's where you see external impacts that are affecting the brain, and that can affect the entire brain or just a section of the brain. Acquired brain injury is a type of injury to the brain which is not hereditary, degenerative, or induced by birth trauma. The main causes of traumatic brain injury are, number one, are falls. 35.2% of all traumatic brain injuries in both adult and pediatrics are falls, followed by motor vehicle and traffic accidents at 17%, and then struck by and against an object. So again, the struck by or against an object would include injuries from child abuse, brain bleeds, skull fractures from child abuse, and also those sports-related injuries and concussions would fall under that as well. Acquired brain injury we most often see for kids is a lack of oxygen, which can occur after a near drowning experience. And we also see acquired brain injury in children because of different infections such as meningitis, or also tumors as well. The Glasgow Coma Scale is what categorizes mild, moderate, and severe injuries. And I wanted to give this to you for your reference. The Glasgow Coma Scale measures eye opening and movement and verbal and motor response. But I do think it's really important to point out as well that mild injuries, even though the term mild gives it, may make you think that they have mild challenges because of that injury. A mild injury can really cause a significant impact, even though the injury itself was mild. And I think that this is especially true with children. The brain regulates many bodily functions. If we just think about how many different things we did this morning before we brushed our teeth, all the different steps we took, all of the physical movements and the cognitive patterns that we had, there's so many things that we do daily that we take for granted that the brain regulates. And any brain injury can cause disruption in any of these functions. And while each injury is very unique, in location, severity, type of injury, age of injury can all play a huge role on how someone is impacted because of their brain injury. Anyone can be physically, emotionally, cognitively altered, and we may also see a lot of changes in personality. And depending on where the location of the injury is, you may see more of these challenges. So with the frontal lobe, you have a lot of these really important skills that we take for granted every day. Initiation of tasks, problem solving, judgment, being able to plan and anticipate events, understanding cause and effect, and understanding the process of having to do one step before the next. Even if someone is physically very able after their brain injury, if they have some of these frontal lobe issues, they may not be able to live independently, even if they appear to be very quote-unquote normal. And frontal injuries can be a really big issue in pediatrics. A lot of pediatric injuries seem to affect the frontal lobe, which can cause a lot of developmental issues. The frontal lobe, if it's developed normally, isn't fully developed until about age 20 or 21. So any injury prior to that can really affect how a child develops. Memory, which is listed here under the temporal lobe, is another really big issue after brain injury, regardless of where your injury is. Memory really uses all sorts of facets of the brain in all different areas of the brain. Whether it's understanding new information and then being able to encode it and keep it into short-term memory, and then being able to shift it over to long-term memory, and then being able to pull that memory out when it's needed or when it's useful. You're using all different sections of your brain for that. And obviously memory can play a huge role in everything that we do. So if someone has a brain injury, they may have short-term or long-term memory problems. They may have issues retaining new information, but have no problem recalling information that they had previous to their injury. As I mentioned, challenges after a brain injury can encompass all of these things: physical, cognitive, emotional, social, and personality. All of these things can be changed and altered. Oftentimes after brain injury, we do see issues with thinking and reasoning, understanding words, being able to stay attentive, problems with impulsivity, all sorts of different things that can occur after brain injury. And all of these things can affect someone socially, and it can affect their relationships. So any of these challenges that may occur after brain injury can stem off into any other area of their life. And these are things that are really important to keep in mind as you're trying to balance someone's abilities with realities and expectations as you are trying to help them with long-term planning and transition planning. And brain injury really can play a big role on development. Again, any brain injury before the age of 20 can disrupt the developmental process. In most pediatric cases, patients are able to function independently 8 years post-injury. Even those with the most severe injuries are likely to be able to achieve some independence and function over time. And there are some really important factors as to success rates in pediatric brain injury and their ability to live and function independently. And consistently, we see that neurorehab improves the future, and integration is crucial for social development. It is really easy to get isolated after brain injury, especially with children, and that can play a huge role in their developmental process. But first and foremost, the most important factor when it comes to children recovering from brain injury is family participation. Family participation and involvement improves outcomes more than anything else. It's more important for outcomes than social capital or income combined. And it's very, very important that family is involved in transition planning. So now we're going to move into transition planning specifically. So when I say transition planning, this is the blanket definition of what we're talking about here. Transition planning is a process that brings together a student and those individuals directly involved in helping the student prepare to enter post-school environment. Now we'll break that down. So who should be involved in this? As I just mentioned, family plays a really, really crucial role. Parents and other family members, as much as they can be involved, the better the outcomes typically are for a child. In IEP meetings or any transitional meetings that you might be having, these are the people that you most see involved: the student, the parents, educators, and other supports. I think it's really important to recognize that anyone can be invited to participate in these meetings, whether it's service providers, siblings, other mentors, anyone that you think can add something to the conversation and provide something that would be beneficial to the student and their planning. It's also important to realize that any transition planning meeting, a student must be invited to. If it involves transition in any way, students must be invited. In the state of Iowa, transition planning is supposed to begin in 8th grade for those students that have an IEP. Anyone can request transition planning, however. You don't have to have an IEP to get those services and to have those conversations. Whether you have a 504 plan for your child or you're just getting some extra tutoring services, whatever it would be, you can ask for this and request a transition planning team. It's never too early or too late to start transition planning. Of course, the earlier you can get started, the better. The more that you can have arranged, the better. The less stress it'll be in the long run. But sometimes that's not always possible, so it's also important to realize it's never too late to get started on this either. So the idea of transition planning is to ensure quality living, learning, and working for the student. And I think it's really, really important to encompass all of these things in transition planning. Living is something that I think is often left out of transition planning. So you may figure out housing and you may figure out transportation. If everyone could make sure that their line is muted, that would be great. I'm getting some feedback now. Again, please make sure that your line is muted. We're getting some feedback here. All right. Okay, so again, including these things in all of your transition planning are very important. And with living, that doesn't just mean, where you're physically going to live, what your housing situation is. Of course, that's part of it, but it's also important to consider the things that improve quality of life. What are your hobbies? Who are the people that are important to you? What are the activities that are important to you? And include those in your transition planning. So why is transition planning with brain injury unique? Well, timing of injury can play a really large role. If you have a student who acquires a brain injury in high school, prior to that injury, they may have never needed to use any extra services. That student and those parents may have no idea what an IEP is or what a 504 plan is, and they never needed to know the resources that they might now need to be accessing. So that timing of injury can be really, really crucial. And it has a huge impact on survivors and families as they're trying to adjust to this and take on the stress of these new roles that they needed to plan. So for example, we work with a client who, prior to her injury, had planned to accept a full athletic scholarship to a state university and to go to school to become a physical therapist. And unfortunately, at 17, she was involved in a motor vehicle crash, and a lot of those plans changed. And this happens to so many students, that you're thrown into dealing with the fact that, this accident happened, you have this injury, you're trying to compensate for all of these new challenges, but your future also looks different now. And you're trying to balance those realities and with those expectations. And again, with the timing of injury, that has a huge impact on the survivor and the families. They might be grappling with a lot of lost sense of self and trying to figure out what their new normal is, and whatever that means. It can have a really huge emotional impact if they are presented with needing transition assistance when they never really planned on needing that in the past. And I will get back to that client story in just a little bit. So how to plan for transition planning. First and foremost, it's really important to plan as early as you possibly can. But of course, just like I just said, timing of injury may affect that greatly. But as early as possible, the earlier the better. It's also very, very important to identify goals early and often. You don't have to wait until your annual meeting to reevaluate goals. If you have a student who doesn't really seem all that invested anymore, in the original goals, then it might be time to reevaluate those goals and come up with a different plan. You don't have to waste an entire year and wait until the next annual meeting. So again, I just really encourage you to identify and reevaluate those goals early and often. Identify supports and services needed as early as possible as well. Oftentimes we find that there are a lot of wait lists. So whether that is for the funding that you need to to acquire services, or whether that's just starting the service and support in general, there are a lot of wait lists out there. So identifying what you might possibly need and getting on waiting lists sooner rather than later is huge. As parents, as professionals, as advocates, it's very important to do your research, to ask a lot of questions, do a lot of Googling. There are a lot of resources out there, and there are new resources that come out every day. So it's very important to do research continually, again, early and often. And most importantly, have high expectations. If you have low expectations, that's setting up for low achievement. If families don't have high expectations, the students and professionals working with that student will also not have high expectations. And I also wanted to add, it's really important to focus on the positives, and to your challenge as a professional, as a parent, as a loved one, is to see beyond the limitations and to find those resources and to utilize them so that the dreams that these children have are becoming a reality. And of course, as I've said multiple times, family needs to be involved. Family is the most important thing, way beyond social status or income. Family involvement is the #1 success rate for students with disabilities post-high school. Families need to, again, encourage high expectations, whether that's starting early by giving chores and different responsibilities. One example, a child that we worked with was trying to find employment and was having some trouble with that because of some behaviors and some anxieties that were there as well, along with his brain injury. But we did find out that he really liked to clean. His room was immaculate. His parents, really just kept mentioning, but he really likes to clean. So we were able to kind of work together and figure out, if there was a job that he could have that might be able to utilize that. That's something that he really did enjoy, that he had control over, that he felt comfortable with. So he started a job with help of a job coach to clean up a restaurant after it was closed. But one of the things that became a challenge that was addressed later on was that when it came to vacuuming, he didn't plug the vacuum in, and he wasn't very productive in his vacuuming, although he really did like to do it. So that was just an example of something that the simple responsibilities that can be given can really, really benefit a child later in life. And those little things that we don't think about, like plugging in the vacuum, encouraging independence in all different ways, can really benefit a child as they are transitioning into adulthood and finding those employment opportunities or whatever it is that allows them to live independently. I also think it's very important to acknowledge the emotional impact on family. So whether it's dealing with the injury because it's relatively recent, or it's just dealing with the emotions that come with your child turning 18 and leaving the home. While it's very good, and many families are excited and want to foster that independence, it's also a very large change, and it's something that should be recognized by the professionals working with families, that there is a large emotional impact, and it's important to recognize that and also to support families through that. So these are a few resources that I wanted to give you as you do support families through that emotional impact. Findfamilies.org and familytofamily.org, as well as resources that we have on our website, the new caregiver website, and then a pediatric specific page as well. And again, all of this will be available to you within the next day or two on our website, so you don't have to frantically jot any of these down as I continue through the presentation to give you more resources. Student involvement is very, very important. If students are not involved, then they're not going to be invested. And that's going to be a really big problem when they turn 18 and the ball is in their court, because at 18, they're in charge. So it's really important to involve students when it comes to defining those goals and involving them early and often. Again, if they've lost interest in a certain step or a certain goal, hear them out and talk to them about maybe reevaluating that goal and shifting to a different goal. It's really important for students to try new things. So as parents and professionals, to encourage them to try new things is one of the best things that we can do. If something doesn't work out, that's not a failure. The student learned that that wasn't something that they want to do. That's not a field that they want to be in. And that's okay, because that's the process of defining interests and reevaluating goals. So with student involvement, some things to consider. What are the educational goals of the student? You know, is completing their high school education and getting that diploma, is that their goal? Or is going on to more college, going to a university, is that important to them? Also evaluate what their employment goals are, because they may need to have more education to reach those employment goals, whether it is going to college or if it's completing a certification program. It's also important to think, where will you live? What will you do for fun? Where will you need assistance in all of those areas of your life, and who will provide that assistance? And again, getting that worked out sooner rather than later due to wait lists is always a good thing. And the most important thing is finding a balance between expectations and realities, because it is important to have high expectations, but of course you have to understand your reality as well. So the student that I mentioned a few minutes ago, who was planning to go to a state university on an athletic scholarship and wanted to become a physical therapist. Well, after her brain injury and after recovering from a lot of her physical challenges, she still had some physical barriers that were going to be there with her, and challenges that were going to be there with her for the rest of her life. So it was really important to balance what it was that she wanted to do and also those realities. So because of her physical limitations, she wasn't going to be able to follow through with her athletic scholarship, and she wasn't going to be able to become a physical therapist because of physical imbalance and gait issues that she continues to have. But we were able to encompass those interests and those passions that she did have in sports medicine and fitness, and she is now going to school and taking classes to become a personal trainer. So that was her way of balancing her expectations and her realities. I Have a Plan Iowa is the program that we have here in Iowa that is involved with the transition planning that is required for students with an IEP, but again, anyone can request it. You do not have to have an IEP to get these services. It is to begin in 8th grade, and that involves the assessments and interest surveys and goal setting. And by doing those surveys and assessing goals and setting those goals, it identifies supports and creates linkage that would be needed to make those dreams a reality. And this is the link to I Have a Plan Iowa. Other planning resources, regardless of whether the student is going to go on to college or if they are going to go on into the employment world. These are some other planning resources that might be accessed, vocational rehabilitation, Iowa Department of Education, the AEAs across the state. Many of them have brain injury resource teams. The Parent Educator Connection, Ask Resources, Iowa Compass, and of course, the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa. All really, really good resources that can be utilized in those transition plannings, whether it's for education or work or just living. And any of these can be utilized in planning, and those staff people can be invited to IEP meetings to help plan as well. So learning. It's really, really important whether you're going to be going on to a college or any other type of learning to consider all of these things. Really important to gather as much information as you can on the topic related to your goals, whether that's a certification program or continuing on to a university. It's also really important to seek appropriate accommodations and to use external devices and techniques that may be able to help as well. And we're going to go into more detail for all of these, but I did wanted to point out a couple of those devices that might be an aid in learning. So going to college. If going to college is in the plans for the student that you're working with, these are some important things to consider. State and federal law that apply to public schools don't apply to colleges. Special education ends upon graduation or age 21, whichever comes first. But colleges cannot discriminate based on disability alone. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 states that no otherwise qualified disabled individual can be denied access to or participation in any federally funded activity or program solely based on disability. So no one can be excluded from something specifically because of their disability with no other reason. So if you qualify for all of the requirements to get into a school and everything else is met, but you have a disability, that is not a reason that someone can deny access to that program. In the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, Title I it applies to work, but it also does apply for colleges and universities. So this is also something that's good to know if college is in your future. Any modification or adjustment to a job, employment, practice, or work environment that makes it possible to participate in and enjoy an equal opportunity. So basically, reasonable accommodations based on a disability need to be made. And that's, again, not just for a work environment, but also for a school environment. However, to be able to access school accommodations, you do have to disclose your disability and provide clinical documentation to the appropriate source. Usually with most colleges, that's the Student of Disabilities office, excuse me. Some things to consider when selecting a school is the campus accessible. If you do have some physical impairments, that is something that is very important, not only in the classroom, but also depending on the housing that might be available to you. If dorm rooms are accessible, if those buildings are accessible, that's very important to consider before selecting a school. Who can help with the application process? Some schools have staff available that can help with the applications for getting into a specific program or for financial aid. And I don't know who has looked at one of those financial aid applications lately, but they may as well be in a different language. So it's really, really great if they have someone available who is able to help you with that application process. And a lot of schools do, but not all schools do. So it is important to consider that as well when looking for a program. It's also important to figure out what documentation of your disability is required and by whom, whether that's your family doctor or a neurologist or a neuropsychologist. It's really important to figure out exactly what is needed and by whom before you start class. You want to make sure that all of those, all that paperwork is in order before starting a class. You also may want to figure out if priority registration is allowed. So with priority registration, students are allowed to register for classes before it opens up to the general public, which may assist a student who needs a specific type of schedule, needs a certain amount of time between classes to ensure that they can get there safely. Not all schools allow priority registration, and many of them have different regulations as to who is allowed to access that. So that's very important to consider when selecting a school as well. Reduced course loads are another thing you may want to check in. It varies by school and is really important when it comes to financial aid. If you're accessing financial aid, you need to know what the requirements are for your caseload, for your course load, excuse me. Because many financial aid programs are only guaranteed to a student if they are a full-time student. There is some leeway there, but you just want to check with your specific school and your specific program on that. Again, before school starts, so you don't wind up with way less financial assistance than you expected. You also want to figure out what services are available to students, whether there's a tutoring center, a writing center, what their disability service office looks like, what they have to offer there. It's also beneficial sometimes to get an academic advisor who has experience working with students with disabilities. Some schools do have specific advisors who have experience and may be able to help guide you a little bit more than other academic advisors. So that is something that you can request at most schools, but again, something that you want to look into prior to selecting your program. Different compensations to consider. Of course, everyone's brain injury is different, and everyone's challenge that they may have after brain injury can be very different. But there are a lot of different accommodations that one could consider, and again, it's very important to do so prior to starting classes. A couple examples for tips with verbal language are for students to speak loudly and clearly, to prepare questions that they may have on a certain topic before the lecture, trying to keep comments on topic. So again, that's something that could be prepared by the student prior to lecture. If there's a reading assigned, if they write down questions and comments that they have as they go through the reading, that sometimes helps them keep on track in class and be able to ask the most appropriate questions to the professor at that time. Also utilize different sources of communication. If writing is something that is easier or better for the student than verbal communication, just let that professor know that and try to utilize writing over verbal communication as much as possible. With written language, getting a note taker is something that can be really useful. Using personal computers in class to take written notes from oral lecture, or bringing a recording device to record lecture to then do that later. Sometimes that helps students retain information and learn better that way. With auditory compensations, sit in front of class, bring your textbook to class, try to develop an outline from lecture on what it is that you might need to study or what you might need for certain assignments. And again, taping, recording a lecture can be really beneficial as well. Copying information off of the board, just getting as much information down as you can that you can see visually can also be very helpful. Organizers can be really important for students with disabilities, especially with memory issues. Trying to get an assignment notebook so you have all of your assignments written down that you need to do day by day along with your to-do lists can be really, really helpful for organization and for memory alike. Dating your notes is something that can be really simple so that you can go back and find things again. Color coding on different topics, highlighting notes, those can all be really good organizational memory techniques, but just good solid studying techniques as well. And as far as studying, trying to join study groups, get involved with a study partner or a tutoring service as well. Those are all compensations to consider when you are going to college. Resources transitioning to college, all of these can be utilized when it comes to developing a plan with the Disabilities Service Office. The speech, occupational, physical therapists, as well as voc rehab, academic advisors, and your neuropsychologist can all provide feedback with specific compensations and accommodations that may benefit that particular student based on where their challenges and deficits are. It's completely inappropriate to get those services and professionals involved in that. And then working with the Student Disability Service Office and Student Life Office is also really important to make sure that all of those accommodations can be met and see what other services are available. Different colleges have very specific services available to just their college, and you don't know if you don't ask. So trying to connect with them is also very important for that. Now, when it comes to working, if that's a really big part of transitioning and transitioning to adulthood, these are some things that you would want to consider. What are the students' interests, what are their goals, and what are their abilities? Again, trying to find that balance between expectations and realities. When working with students, trying to figure out what their goals will require as far as if they need more schooling, if they need more training, a different certification program, whatever it might be. What tools will they need to meet those goals, and are those goals realistic? Who and what services need to be in place to make the student successful, to make their dreams into a reality? Identifying those early is really, really helpful. And establishing a plan with timeframes and meeting goals. It's really, really important to put these goals and different plans down in writing. It's great to think it, but you really need to put it down in writing as well. Some tools that may help identify those goals and assess interests and abilities, again, are that I Have a Plan Iowa, because those assessments, well, they can really be useful to anyone because they assess strengths, interests, abilities, and kind of prioritize what the student's goals are. So that can be very, very helpful in terms of transitioning to work. The second website on here is onetonline.org. They have similar interest surveys, another resource that can be utilized for finding strengths and abilities and putting those into practice for the working environment. Additional resources for working are listed here: Iowa Vocational Rehab, Iowa Workforce Development, and if you have a student who is on or will be on some type of Social Security, getting involved with work incentive planning and assistance can be really beneficial. Programs like Community Work Incentives through Disability Rights Iowa and Ticket to Work, they can be really, really great resources to answer questions about how much someone can work with the amount that they're getting through Social Security, help with that benefits planning for long term, can help answer questions about trial work periods, all of those things that students may be questioning as they're looking to go into the workforce. Local colleges and different services like Goodwill Employment Services can help with job coaching and job skills, which is also something that is can be utilized as students are looking into work in different services that are out there. And again, with that, to keep in mind that there are often waiting lists for these services and for these programs. So getting involved and getting on those waiting lists sooner rather than later can be really beneficial for a smooth transition. So when it comes to disclosing a disability in a workplace, it's completely up to the individual on whether or not they want to disclose that they have a disability to their employer. But the one time that it really is necessary to disclose your disability is if you need an accommodation. And again, as we mentioned earlier, workplaces and environments are obligated to attend to reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities. But in order to access that, that is the time that you do have to disclose disabilities. And this askjan.org is a website that has more information on that might be helpful for individuals going into the workforce that may have questions about those reasonable accommodations, what is considered to be a reasonable accommodation, and different suggestions based on where those challenges may lie. So living, that is the one part. We talked about learning, we talked about working, but living is another part of that transitional piece that is really, really important. And I would encourage you all to not forget this piece. It's very, very important as students transition into adulthood and for their long-term quality of life. Recognize what their hobbies are, recognize where they're going to be versus where their friends and their families and different activities are that they're involved in, and making sure that if they are moving to a new area that they consider those that they consider that piece of it. If they're interested in a specific hobby, that they can find that in their new area. If they're moving and really want to utilize a support group, trying to find those new pieces in their area for living as well. And then trying to figure out how they're going to get transportation to participate in those activities. And if those activities require money, how are they going to financially plan for that? These are all very important things that come secondary often to the very literal living, which is the housing situation. These are the things that get put on the wayside. So just a reminder to not forget those pieces of living, as they are very important to young adults becoming independent. So other resources that might be helpful. On our website, we have a page for educational resources as well as vocational resources. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a new page for caregivers, and we also have a page specific to pediatrics. So all of these would offer more suggestions and more resources, more services that are out there that might be beneficial as you're working with students who are transitioning. Of course, students and professionals can always connect to us here at the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa. You can connect with us on our toll-free number. We provide different educational and informational services, but our most direct support is called Neuro-Resource Facilitation, which is similar to case management, which we try to connect people to other services and resources in their community, and help advocate for them to get other supports in their life so that they can turn their dreams into a reality. And we also offer that support to professionals on a case consult basis, so that we can help you support the students that you're working with and other individuals with brain injury. So some final considerations before we get to questions. Some tips from parents for parents. Don't underestimate the emotional toll. Again, when you have a child who's turning 18 and leaving the nest that can be that can have a really significant emotional toll that is often overlooked. If some guardianship needs to be in place to make sure that those issues were worked out before age 18, because at 18, they become their own guardian, they make their own decisions. There may be some students that need guardianship or need a payee, and all of those different services that come with that. It's really important to utilize those and get those in place before they turn 18. And I didn't talk about these in our presentation today, but again, if this is an area that you'd like more information on, please don't hesitate to contact us, and we'd be happy to get you more information on that issue, as that is a piece of transition planning as well. Again, expect waitlists. There are a lot of great programs and services out there, but there are a lot of people who want those services and programs as well. So getting on waitlists so that you can utilize those programs and have a smooth transition as students are transitioning is really very important. And it's always important to stay positive. Again, if you have a student who had an experience that didn't really work out, that's okay. They learned something from that experience. And positives can be found in many unexpected places. And again, trying to find that balance between expectations and realities is very, very important in not only the life for the student, but supporting that student as well as a parent or a professional. All right, and now I would encourage you all to pull out those questions that you've been writing down all through this presentation, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that you have. And again, this webinar will be available on our website in the next day or so. And I will be sending out a survey asking for your feedback as well at the end of this presentation. And if anyone has any specific questions that they would rather discuss directly, that's why my contact information is up here. Feel free to contact me, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have or to brainstorm on any cases that you might have. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them at this time. Otherwise, thank you very, very much for participating today. And again, the webinar will be accessed on our website in the next day or two so that you can have all of these resources and materials.
Are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, there's a question that came in. This is Jeff, but I have a question about having significant problems with behavioral issues with clients. Some are related to the denial of disability. Therefore, it's difficult to provide appropriate services if the client is in denial. So it's their denial of the disability. Psychological and neuropsych is helpful, but do you have any thoughts about clients that are in denial?
The student itself is in denial?
Sure.
Yeah, I think that happens pretty frequently, especially with individuals who may have gotten their injury a little later in their still young life. That whether it's the student or the parents that may have some denial, it's just it just takes a little bit more time and education. I think a lot of the times explaining these resources and explaining that utilizing these resources doesn't make anyone weak or less intelligent or whatever it might be. I think a lot of the time it's just that it's such a new thing that they don't even really know where to begin, and that denial is is common, and it's normal really to have some of that denial there. So just providing that education and information is really the most important thing too. And of course it depends on the situation, because I think a lot of the times too we have if on the other hand an injury happened very young, and we weren't really seeing a lot of changes or challenges at the beginning, and then maybe as developmental milestones aren't being hit, it's kind of now coming out that um, that really that injury is affecting them more in school or their daily life, whatever it might be, and that oftentimes we see denial as well. And again, it's just trying to re-educate and get those supports and services there in their life. There's really no right answer to that, but just trying to provide that education based on their unique needs.
Thank you. That was helpful. Again, Jeff Lauer here. Holly, sorry for jumping in. I think I have administrative access, so I saw that come up via the chat questions. So if you have people here who are shy and don't want to speak up, they could always type it into the question box, and then we can just read your question. Holly, are there any other common questions that come to mind that you hear either parents or, well, particularly parents, asking that maybe don't have easy answers?
Um, I mean, I think there certainly are a lot of questions that don't have um, easy answers, and especially when they are really trying to adjust to what that new reality might be, so that their plans for their future may have changed, and trying to adjust to that, and to recognize those changes. I mean, like I said, it's important to find the balance between reality and expectations, but that's a lot easier for me to say and then for someone to do. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that that's the hardest part for both parents and students, is to try to find that balance there.
Thank you. What is a good, here's another question that came in. What is a good avenue for a family to engage in with the school system as both the educator and the family, when both the educator and the family are new to providing accommodations? What's the best way to, get in there and try to engage without being, um, I guess, what are the stumbling blocks, or how do you avoid the stumbling blocks?
Well, that is tough, especially when the family and the educators with this particular student, this might be a totally new avenue. Um, I mean, as parents, of course, they're always their child's number one advocate. So they can always request an IEP or a 504 plan. They can always request that I have a plan Iowa for transition planning, even if they don't have any of those other services in place.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always completely appropriate to just to schedule a meeting with those educators and supports that are involved, just to see what transition services might be available that are out there. I think that we oftentimes work with families that's where they're at. They really don't even know where to start, and they've never had to utilize these services before. So it's finding the right contact people. If they're either the injury isn't new, but they're moving to a new area, or if the injury is new and they're in wherever they might be, getting them connected with the AEA. If there's a brain injury resource team involved, getting them connected with those folks. Getting in to talk with someone in the school, and depending on the school district, it might be someone different.
Mm-hmm.
Whether well, yeah, they all can have a different process to that, but just trying to connect those families with those people, and sitting down to have a meeting is really the first step is connecting with those educators that are there directly, and trying to get some services there with getting the AA or AEA involved as well.
There's a comment here that says, first time you go to the IEP, bring cookies. I don't know if that works all across the country. I see that we've got some people dialed in here today from all across the country, California to the other coast as well. So in Iowa, we definitely find that if you bring food, it sets a different tone. It shouldn't be that way. In fact, probably the educational system should be the ones that have the food there. It won't be as good, but there is a certain amount of building relationships that I think this is trying to point to.
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't think bringing cookies is a bad idea.
No. Peanut-free in the schools is probably
That's right.
a decent idea, at least given what I see. One more question is, um, so if things are all set for your child in, say, a given year, the beginning of third or fourth grade, when should you start to work and plan for the next year?
Well, usually that schedule is set by the schools where they have annual meetings, and usually it's in the fall, actually at the beginning of
Mm-hmm.
school.
Okay.
Sometimes they do it before the previous year, which I think can be very beneficial before you get into the first couple weeks of school, and you've already kind of missed those first 2 weeks of setting those new goals. But you can always request an additional meeting. Annual goals are always set and always expected, but you can always request additional meetings, which I would encourage as goals change and as things change for that student. Um, I mean, a lot of the times the students will meet their goals faster than they originally anticipated. And that's a really great reason to have another meeting to set more goals and continue those high expectations and not waiting until the next year.
Great. Jessica DeWitt, do you have a question? We have one. I guess people are probably on mute. Jessica, if you can type it in, we can read it. I'm not sure if that's something you can do fast enough. Um, or if you're, maybe we can see you here. Let me see about unmuting you. We have a whole raft of people across the country on right now. So I'm unmuting you, Jessica. Sorry about that. Jessica, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Sorry about that. I'm not the greatest
Oh,
technician. Go ahead.
okay. So I know that Holly had said that one of the greatest indicators of success is the participation of the family. And just speaking in regards to that positivity, sometimes I find that it's actually the family that puts those limitations on the individual. And I was just wondering if you had any suggestions on, as an individual that's involved with the person. Like for me, for example, I'm a caseworker,
Mm-hmm.
and I think one of the things that I bring to the table is just kind of that like no limitations attitude, but the family doesn't always feel that way. So do you have any suggestions on how to open up that conversation to help get them to a point where they can start thinking that way in order to encourage that out of the individual as well?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I think that's something that is pretty common actually, and there could be different reasons for that, really. I think that sometimes parents are really scared and they're trying to be protective because they don't want to watch their students fail, and they just totally don't even recognize the fact that they may be limiting their experiences a little bit. So I think as professionals, you kind of have to work that fence where you have to be understanding and be supportive of the fact that they may just be scared and they may just be trying to protect their child because that's what they've done the last 17 years. Um, but also trying to encourage them to have high expectations and try to remind them that everything that they do with their child is important. And everything that they do or say in regards to their child's goals and responsibilities is very important and means something to them. Um, and I think that if the student is willing and if the student is involved, um, it's always best to hear what they have to say. I mean, if they want to do something that maybe the parents are less than encouraging of, trying to get them to speak up and encourage their own empowerment and self-advocacy, to try to get that to be a conversation with the parents and students that is really led by the student themselves, rather than as a professional trying to guess and assume and try to play on both sides of that, if not of wanting to be understanding and supportive, but also, again, no limitations set, and kind of pushing those high expectations. I think that often parents don't even realize that they're doing that. And sometimes hearing it from the student can be more powerful than 10 professionals telling them something as well, if that's something that they're invested in and want to talk about. Does that answer your question?
Sorry, I muted her and she says it did.
Okay.
Sorry. There are no more questions, Holly.
Okay. Well, if anyone thinks of any questions or you had a question that I didn't get answered, again, feel free to contact me. My contact information is up here on the screen, and I would be happy to answer any additional questions that you have. And thank you all very much for joining us today. I really do think this is an important topic, and I'm glad to see so many other people think that it is important as well. And again, this will be put on our website within the next day or two, and I will be sending out a survey for feedback on this topic. So that's it. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you.